Thank you very much for that. Today we are going to be having two messages. Could be considered a split sermon, if you will, although the first one may be a little longer than a sermonette, a little less than a split sermon. But in any case, we're going to have two messages today. And the first one is going to be one of the past programs of the Quest for Truth telecast that we produced. This program, actually, I had spoken with Mr. Fox in Pennsylvania, who informed me that there was going to be some changes to the station that broadcasts our program in his area. A lot of things are moving digitally, and so there will not be a need to send discs to that part of the country any longer, that we will be exchanging files electronically, which is helpful for everyone, actually. It makes it easier for us and easier for Bill. And so with that in mind, I decided to go back this week and go back several years and look at some of the old programs where we used to have the name The World to Come, and we had changed that name about, I think it's probably 6 years ago now, something like that, maybe 5. In any case, some of the programs around that time are worth continuing to use. And so I'd spent a little bit of time this week to just switch out the front end and the middle and the end of the program so that it shows our new name for the television program, Quest for Truth. And so we're going to watch in one that's about 7 years old. This was recorded in 2015, still, of course, very valid for today. And this program, that will be the first message for today, is titled, Does God Hate Christmas? Good question. Let's find out. The days of winter bring with it displays of colorful lights and a seemingly endless amount of Christmas paraphernalia. The songs of the winter holidays permeate the air, and their melodies lull people into a festive trance where millions believe they are honoring Christ through their Christmas activities. But does God approve of the holiday of Christmas? Should we celebrate the Messiah's birthday at all? When was Christ born? Is Christmas truly a Christian holiday? Where did the many traditions of Christmas originate? Well, in just a few moments, you will learn why the most popular of all Christian holidays is not Christian. Stay tuned. You know, the winter season ushers in all sorts of activities that are centered around the holiday of Christmas. And with this celebration comes the decorating of an evergreen tree, the hanging of stockings, decking the halls with boughs of holly, and hanging mistletoe. There are various versions of the mythical Santa Claus waiting in local malls to listen to the wishes of children. There are Christmas plays, parties, caroling, and perhaps the most well-known activity of this season is shopping sprees, where multitudes of gifts are purchased and wrapped up and placed beneath the branches of the beloved Christmas tree. It is claimed by most that these festivities are carried out in honor of Jesus Christ. This, combined with all of the joy such activity brings, makes Christmas the most popular of all holidays. However, this supposed Christian holiday truly has nothing to do with the Messiah, at least according to the Bible. But how could this be, you might ask? How could centuries of Catholicism, Protestantism, Mormonism, and dozens of other faiths be entirely mistaken about such a cherished observance? Well, the truth of the matter can be realized when we simply read the Bible. And though Christmas claims to be a holiday focused on the birth of Christ, the Scriptures give absolutely no indication of the date of the Messiah's birth or of the New Testament church that began choosing to celebrate this day. Even the apocryphal writings do not indicate the month or day that he was born. In fact, it was not until 200 AD that a teacher from Egypt referenced Christ's birthday. However, his references only speak of various opinions. Notice the words written by Clement of Alexandria at the beginning of the 3rd century AD. There are those who have determined not only the year of our Lord's birth, but also the day, and they say that it took place in the 28th year of Augustus, and in the 25th day of the Egyptian month, Pacon, which would be May 20th in our calendar. Further, others say that he was born on the 24th or 25th of Pharmuthi, which would be April 20th or 21st, and the calendar as we know today. We see then that the earliest writings speaking of the day of Christ's birth are nothing but hearsay. In addition, such opinions of ancient religious leaders indicate that they believed he was born sometime in the spring. In fact, when we consider the biblical record, the Scriptures reveal that the time of Christ's birth was somewhere, possibly in the fall. As Luke wrote, there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Shepherds living in the fields with their flocks would never occur in the dead of winter. Why, the common practice was for shepherds to bring their flocks in from the mountains and fields, corralling them beginning in mid-October. And this was done to protect the sheep from the cold, wet weather during the winter months. Adam Clarke related this in his commentary, that it was the custom of shepherds to send their sheep into the mountains and fields during the spring around the time of the Passover, and to bring them back at the beginning of the first rains. Werner Keller is another author that wrote a book titled The Bible as History, and this provides some clear insight regarding this issue. At Christmas time, Bethlehem is in the grip of frost, and in the Promised Land, no cattle would have been in the fields in that temperature. This fact is borne out by a remark in the Talmud to the effect that in that neighborhood the flocks were put out to grass in March and brought in again at the beginning of November. Notice that even the Jewish Talmud indicates that Christ could not have been born anywhere near December 25th. In fact, when we further examine the Scriptures, they point to Christ actually being born in the early days of fall. Why, the Gospel of Luke records an event in which the angel Gabriel visited a priest named Zacharias and informed him that his wife Elizabeth would give birth to a son. This son would become known as John the Baptist. Now, Gabriel made this announcement while Zacharias was serving in the temple, and Luke indicated that Zacharias performed his service during the course of Abijah. Now, according to the book of 1 Chronicles, Abijah served during the 8th course. And the Jewish historian Josephus wrote that each course was 1 week long, with priests rotating so that each would serve twice during the year. And so in this case, Zacharias would have served from Iyar 27 through Sivan 5. And this period coincides with late May and early June. Now bear with me to understand why these dates are important. You see, Luke's gospel goes on to state that Zacharias returned home immediately after his days of service were complete. And shortly after his return, his wife Elizabeth conceived. And this would mean that her conception would have taken place during June or July at the latest. And so the birth of John the Baptist would have taken place in the spring. But what does this have to do with the birth of Christ, you might ask? Well, Luke's gospel indicates that the angel Gabriel also spoke to Mary and informed her that she would give birth to the Messiah. Now, when Mary asked how she would know this was true, the angel explained, "Now indeed,
Elizabeth, your relative, has also conceived a son in her old age, and this is now the 6th month for her who was called barren." After receiving this news, Mary then left her home to seek Elizabeth. When she came, Elizabeth confirmed that Christ had already been conceived within Mary. And for this reason, the 6-month-old child that was in Elizabeth's womb leaped. And the time of this visit was during the winter. And so this being the case, Christ would have been born 9 months later, in the fall, not in the winter. And so clearly the Messiah was not born on or even near December 25th. And any representation to the contrary is entirely baseless and false. And so where did the celebration of December 25th come from? Well, we can begin to understand the truth when we examine the secular and even pagan history of Rome. After the death of Christ and the establishment of a congregation in Rome, the Roman Church maintained a staunch position against pagan beliefs and practices. However, many new potential converts were reluctant to give up their cherished celebrations that were based in false religion. As the Roman Church fragmented, with a majority becoming corrupt, it was decided by the Church that they would begin to adopt many of these heathen holidays and change their names and meanings to be more acceptable to the Christian faith. Now, one of these pagan celebrations that was confiscated was a winter solstice celebration known as the Saturnalia, and this was celebrated on December 25th. In fact, the earliest mention of December 25th as supposedly being Jesus' birthday comes from a mid-4th century Roman almanac that lists the death of and dates of various bishops and martyrs. Now, the first date listed is December 25th, and it's marked as Natus Christus in Bethlehem, Judea, which means Christ was born in Bethlehem of Judea. And so almost 300 years after Jesus was born, we begin to find people observing his birth in midwinter. But this celebration was adopted from pagan celebrations that were solar festivals. Why, notice what Cheryl Carras wrote in her informative book on the history of the evergreen tree. One of the most popular holidays in the Roman year was the Saturnalia. It was a week-long festival with torchlight processions, gift-giving, and merrymaking, culminating in a winter solstice feast on December 25th, called Natalis Solis Invictor, the birthday of the unconquerable sun. The holiday honored the strength of the sun and the fertility it would soon bring to the earth. In 375 AD, the Church announced that the birth date of Christ had been discovered to be December 25th and allowed some of the light-hearted customs of the older celebration to be incorporated into the reverent observance of Christmas. A presumptuous and now apostate church just happened to discover when Christ was born over 300 years after he died, and then they chose to change the name and meaning of a pagan festival in order to encourage the spread of Christmas and Christianity throughout the empire. And their reasoning was that if Christmas looked like the well-known familiar Saturnalia, well, more pagans would be open to observing the holiday and therefore be more tolerant of accepting Christianity. However, as shocking as it may sound to you, Christ was not born during the month of December, and Christmas is not a Christian holiday sanctioned by Christ's true church. Why, you need to know more about this subject, ladies and gentlemen, and to help you, Quest for Truth has produced an informative booklet. The Eternal Church of God produces a variety of free literature to help readers understand the truth of the Bible, how God expects his people to live, and the destiny of the earth. Today, we would like to offer you the booklet titled The Truth About Christmas. This booklet explains how our modern celebration sprang into existence and why it occurs on December 25th. It will give you the history behind many of its symbols, such as the Yule log, Santa Claus, the Christmas tree, and it will explain the ancient pagan use of holly, mistletoe, and how these ancient traditions were adopted in an attempt to Christianize a pagan holiday. The truth about Christmas is something that every believer needs to understand. So stay tuned, and at the end of this program, we will show you how to receive a free copy of The Truth About Christmas. So far, we have learned that Christ was not born during the month of December. We have also seen that December 25th was a heathen celebration known as Saturnalia, and it's directly related to the worship of the sun. This pagan holiday was confiscated by an apostate organization and recategorized as a supposed Christian festival. Now, there are multitudes of evidence indicating this truth if you just visit your local library and look in any encyclopedia. An example of this comes to us from Ambrose, who was a religious leader of the blossoming apostate church during the late 4th century. And this man described Christ as being the true Son, who outshone the fallen gods of the old order. While this statement relates to an effort to replace the pagan sun god with the Son of God by attempting to put Christ into practices of ancient heathen worship. Another historian, Alfred Holtz, wrote a book titled 1001 Christmas Facts and Fancies. And in this work, he noted the origin of the Christmas celebration, writing this: "The roots of Christmas observance, however, go deeply into the folklore of the Druids, Scandinavians, Romans, and Egyptians. In Scandinavian countries, great fires were kindled to defy the Frost King. The Druids observed this season in their great roofless temples, where torches blazed and strange ceremonies took place dealing with the cutting of the Kabbalistic mistletoe. Two holidays, the Brumalia and Junalia of ancient Rome, were merged to form one great celebration in honor of the Italian deity Saturnus. The Saturnalia was not a day, but a season of celebration from December 17th through the 24th. The period was characterized by processions, singing, lighting candles, adorning the house with laurel and green trees, giving presents, and the men dressed as women or masqueraded in the hides of animals. Even the early Egyptians celebrated this midwinter festival." The connection between Christmas and a variety of pagan practices has been thoroughly documented. Not only the day, but its symbols are intimately connected to festivities of the pagan world. Notice what William Walsh, a recognized authority on Christmas, wrote. "The Christmas festival of today is a gradual evolution from times that long antedated the Christian period. It was overlaid upon heathen festivals, and many of its observances are only adaptations of pagan to Christian ceremonies. It was on or about December 21st that the ancient Greeks celebrated what are known to us as the Bacchanalia, or festivities in honor of Bacchus, the god of wine. In these festivities, the people gave themselves up to songs, dances, and other revels which frequently passed the limits of decency and order. In ancient Rome, the Saturnalia, or festivals in honor of Saturn, the god of time, began on December 17th and continued for 7 days. These also often ended in riot and disorder. Hence the words Bacchanalia and Saturnalia acquired an evil reputation in later times. The evidence of the Christmas connection to pagan festivities is easy to find. For example, consider the traditional beloved song of the 12 days of Christmas. Why, most do not question why 12 days are spoken of when our Christmas holiday is celebrated on a single day, but note what William Walsh wrote regarding these days. "We are most interested in festivals of the ancient Teutonic or German tribes because they are most closely linked with Christmas as we ourselves celebrate it. The pagan feast of the 12 Nights was religiously kept by them from December 25th to January 6th, the latter day being known as it is still known to their descendants as 12th Night. Because pagans observed a 12-day holiday, apostate religious leaders in Rome chose to call December 25th Christmas, the day when Christ was supposedly born, and January 6th Epiphany, claiming that this was the day when the Magi visited the manger. And this 12-day period became known as the 12 days of Christmas. But it was never so. It had long been 12 nights celebrated by pagan tribes. Other clues to the heathen history of Christmas can be found in the traditional Christmas tree. While few question this, and if you think about it, odd ritual of chopping down a tree, carrying it into our homes, and decorating it like a god, and only to place gifts beneath its branches. But notice the ancient history of such an unusual practice. Goddesses and gods were usually worshipped outdoors in naturally protected spots, such as under the trees. Woods found or planted on hills and mountaintops were considered especially suitable places for holy observances. These sacred groves were the forbidden high places mentioned in the Old Testament. Ceremonies honoring the tree involved sacrifices and holy offerings which were placed on the ground beneath it or in its branches. The connection between the Christmas tree and the sacred tree is quite clear. In addition to this, the Book of Festivals, Holy Days, and Saints' Days confirms that the origin of the Christmas tree can be traced to people who did not esteem Christ and the God of the Bible. It, that is the Christmas tree, recapitulates the idea of tree worship and the universe three: lights, flowers, and gilded nuts and balls symbolizing the sun. The Christmas tree is peculiar to Northern Europe and many other customs which we keep in connection with the birthday of our Lord properly belong to the pre-Christian festivals. Other credible works on the tradition of Christmas dramatically declare that the Christmas tree is intimately connected to pagan rites. A book about Christmas folklore reveals the following. Most people have heard that the Christmas tree originates in the Tannenbaum and is some sort of vestige of Teutonic vegetation worship. This is partially true. However, the custom of using pine and other evergreens ceremonially was well established at the Roman Saturnalia, even earlier in Egypt. The modern Christmas tree is directly related to the worship of idols. And today, millions of homes in America and Western nations around the world are adorned with decorated evergreen trees every year. And tragically, people fail to realize what these trees represent because they simply don't want to be bothered with temperance. Ancient Israel was once indicted for engaging in practices that included the veneration of trees. And notice what occurred during the reign of King Ahaz. The Bible records that the children of Israel secretly did against the eternal their God things that were not right, and they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city, and they set up for themselves sacred pillars and wooden images on every high hill and under every green tree. There they burned incense on all the high places, like the nations whom the Eternal had carried away before them. And they did wicked things to provoke the Eternal to anger, for they served idols, of which the Eternal had said to them, "You shall not do this thing." The evidence condemning this practice of idolizing trees is undeniable. I consider the following song and the words that people worshipfully sing to a tree today, and then compare them to the words of Almighty God.
O Christmas tree, O Christmas tree, O tree of green and changing. O Christmas tree, O Christmas tree, O tree of green and changing. Numbers of rain in summertime to break the snow of wintertime. O Christmas tree, O Christmas tree, O tree of green and changing. O Christmas tree, you set my heart a-singing. O Christmas tree, you set my heart a-singing. Like little stars, your candles bright, sent to the world a wondrous light. O Christmas tree, you set my heart a-singing.
Thus says the Eternal, the customs of the peoples are futile. For one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with the axe. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. They are futile, a work of errors. In the time of their punishment, they shall perish. The more we examine the Christmas holiday and compare it to the Bible, the more evidence we find explaining that Christmas is not Christian. Now, some of you might actually agree with this statement, but continue to believe that it's okay to confiscate pagan holidays and redress them and use them to worship God. Well, such an attitude is nothing new. Notice what Cheryl Carras wrote. Many people like to de-emphasize our pagan heritage. We have been taught to associate paganism with violent practices and, therefore, find it threatening to see pagan aspects in our modern, civilized religions. In the case of the Christmas tree, this knowledge can enrich the celebration of the ritual. Could this be true? Is it okay to use the customs of pagans to enrich our worship of the true God? Can we confiscate heathen holidays for Christ? Well, in short, the answer is no. Why, God, in fact, condemns such behavior, and any attempt to worship Him the way the heathen worship their gods is unacceptable. Now, it's essential to understand that God hates a lie. Why, being a false witness is the 9th commandment. And no matter what form it takes, lies are contrary to the truth, and God is a God of truth. On the other hand, Satan is characterized as the father of lies and the deceiver of the whole world. And the scriptures also reveal that Satan appears as an angel of light. And so is it any wonder that festivals honoring pagan gods possess great beauty and they appeal to our senses? Why, pagans did not observe the Saturnalia because it was dark and gloomy. It was fun. They enjoyed it. And because of the warm feelings Christmas brings today, and because the makeover that is received, most would feel that putting a Christian stamp of approval on the Saturnalia and calling it Christmas is justified. Why, believers actually think that they are honoring God by observing this holiday. But let's consider what God said about adopting the traditions of unbelievers and using them to worship Him. In the book of Deuteronomy, the Eternal spoke, and it was written, "Take heed to yourself, that you are not ensnared to follow them, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, well, how did these nations serve their gods? I will do likewise. You shall not worship the Eternal your God in that way. For every abomination to the Eternal which He hates, they have done to their gods. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it, nor take away from it." God tells us that we cannot design our own way to worship Him. And He also stated that we cannot adopt the practices of unbelievers and use their methods to try and honor Christ. Why, if we claim to follow the God of the Bible, if we desire to do what He deems as acceptable, we must be honest and ask ourselves, would God recognize the traditions of heathen as a proper way to honor Christ? Would God approve of the use of pagan traditions to worship Him? Do we somehow think that God is politically correct and He'll accept any and all forms of worship? Why, the answer is clear, and we don't even have to guess. God spells it out for us. Thus says the Eternal, "Learn not the way of the heathen." When we come to understand the truth behind the Christmas holiday and we compare it to the written Word of God, we can easily see that God hates such festivities that claim to be honoring Him. And it's clear that Christmas is one of these celebrations that He does not approve of. It does not bear the mark of Christ in its symbols and traditions. Instead, it is filled with the traditions of people who worship the creation instead of the Creator. Ladies and gentlemen, as shocking as it may sound, the most popular of modern Christianity's holidays is not Christian. And there's much more evidence proving this truth, which has led us to produce an informative booklet. The Eternal Church of God produces a variety of free literature to help readers understand the truth of the Bible, how God expects His people to live, and the destiny of the earth. Today we would like to offer you the booklet titled "The Truth About Christmas." This booklet explains how Christmas morphed into what people celebrate today. It will give you the history behind the many symbols of Christmas, such as the Yule log, Santa Claus, holly, and mistletoe. This booklet explains why people traditionally cut down an evergreen tree and decorate it like a god in their homes. Why the truth about Christmas is something that every believer needs to understand. Stay tuned, and in just a few moments, we will show you how you can receive a free copy of this booklet, The Truth About Christmas. For now, this is Terry Moore saying, thanks for watching.
If you would like the literature offered on this program, please contact Quest for Truth, P.O. Box 80248, Billings, Montana, zip code 59108, or email us at witness@eternalcog.org.
No one knows the day or hour when the end shall come to pass. Not the angels that dwell in heaven, only the Father from above. No one knows the day or hour when the end shall come.
Check? 1, 2, okay. After that, a reminder to those people tuning in electronically that we are still looking for individuals that would be willing to sponsor the Quest for Truth television program in your area. It takes very little effort on your part, and there's no expense involved on your end. Any fees, which are usually minimal for public access channels, local public access channels, will be taken care of. Please reach out to us and we'll see what it would take to get our program running in your area. We do need sponsors in an area. We can't just start contacting different parts of the country and sponsoring on our own. You have to be a part of the community where that public access channel can be accessed in order for you to use their service. So let's go ahead and open our hymnals and turn over. To most people, today is considered to be Christmas Eve. Even though it's still the afternoon, at least in our part of the country, that's what they think it is. Hundreds of millions are set to enjoy the eve of what is the most popular and most widely observed holiday in all of history. To many, this time represents the birth of Jesus. Many people believe this is a holiday about family. It's about tradition. However, the materialism obviously overwhelms the intended meanings of this holiday. Even though a growing number are becoming aware of the origins of the Christmas celebration, it really makes little difference in the activities of most who celebrate this day. They continue to consider Christmas Eve to be a holy night, though it is rarely silent with all of the activities going on. I suppose the silence would come perhaps in the wee hours of the morning when people are kind of sleeping, though restlessly, anticipating getting up the next morning and enjoying the Christmas holiday with the gifts and the food and their rituals. But one day, all of that is going to change. One day, in the not too distant future, the holiday of Christmas is going to come to an end. Jesus Christ is going to return, and he is going to set things in order. God's holy days, instead, are going to become the pillars of a foundation of a society that will worship God in spirit and truth. All will come to understand what true faith and true worship really means and how to perform it. Let's go over to Micah 4 to read a little bit about that. The prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Habakkuk, pretty much all of the prophets of old and even prophets in the New Testament foretell of the time when Christ will return and he will eliminate false days of worship. In Micah chapter 4, the prophet, or I should say God, through the prophet, uses a mountain to represent government. And the prophet Micah wrote in verse 1 that it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Eternal's house shall be established on top of the mountains over all the nations of the earth, and shall be exalted above the hills, and then people shall flow to it. So God's government is going to be established above all nations, all communities of the earth. And people are going to assemble, and they will learn what true freedom and true law and justice is. In the second verse, many nations shall come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Eternal, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. So his ways and his paths, it refers to appropriate behavior, including the proper observance of holy days. Now, the keeping of God's 10 Commandments is foundational, but those are not the only laws that will be enforced. And we've talked about this before, that the 10 Commandments are much like an umbrella under which there are other statutes, judgments, ordinances that will be followed. And these include the removal of false religious holidays, such as Christmas, and instead observing holy days, God's feasts. Out of all of the holidays that have been created by men, none of them can be considered holy. Holiday comes from the expression holy day, but today we use the expression holiday to refer to something that is not really holy. It's just like a mark or an observance. But none of them, nothing that has been instituted by men could be considered holy. Hanukkah is a holiday that's kept by the Jews in honor of the great exploits of the Maccabean revolt. But that day, though not incorrect in remembering that time in history, it is wrong in the way that it is observed, because most people that keep Hanukkah today keep it as like one of their holiest times of the year. They treat it much like a holy day. But the only days that can be considered holy are the ones that have been established by the holy God. Let's go over to Zechariah chapter 14. Hanukkah is found on the Hebrew calendar, and we do not recognize all of the holidays that are found on the Hebrew calendar, but we do agree that the Hebrew calendar is the only one that can be considered legitimate to use for the observance of God's holy days. Rosh Hashanah, for example, is not the head of the year. Seems like Jews, they have two beginnings of the year. One in the spring they recognize, as God had said, but also they have a type of new year found in the winter, or the fall, I should say. For the majority who keep God's feasts, the last day of God's annual holy days is a favorite time of year, the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's likely favored by most because it's a time when we will often travel to a new location. We'll see and do different things. There will be a lot of activities. And we enjoy that time very much. We are carnal. And so God says that during that time, go out and enjoy things that pleases you, things that taste good, even having strong drink if you would like. Have family activities, and then have these 2 days that are designated as Sabbaths, rest days of worship. And we do that, and we enjoy it very much. It's the last holy days of the year for us. Now, interestingly, Christmas is also the last holiday of the year for many. And it too is filled with carnal pleasures. We saw some of that in the telecast. Many of the things that are done on Christmas have their roots in paganism. Some of those things are not evil of themselves, such as something like mistletoe. That's something that God created. It's a part of nature. But the way it is used is inappropriate. And so the way it is used during the Christmas holiday would be considered unlawful. But most are unaware of this. They consider all of the traditions of Christmas to be harmless. However, the Christmas activities, they do not picture any of the steps of the plan of God for mankind, though they claim that it represents the birth of Christ. It does not represent Christ's second coming, the establishment of God's government on the earth. Truly, as we had seen in the program, that day actually does not represent the birth of Christ at all. Still, we see Christmas being a chief holiday of most people, and it's because they have been taught that it is their chief holiday. They have been taught that there is nothing comparable to Christmas, nothing more important than Christmas. But the traditions of Christmas are deeply rooted in the fabric of paganism, and today we see they are deeply fixed among most societies around the world. So when it comes time for people to give up their traditions, to give up those beloved holidays such as Christmas, it is going to be a very hard pill for people to swallow. The prophet Micah also said, and I already turned away from there, but I have it in my notes, he said in verse 3 of chapter 4 that God will judge between many people at that time. And it says he will rebuke strong nations. And the rebuke is going to come with just more than words. With more than just words, I should say. The rebuke will include destroying idols of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of paganism, and even the idols that are found among what we would call traditional Christianity today, although the traditional Christianity of today does not date back to the New Testament church as established by Christ and the apostles. God is also going to destroy idols of the mind that are found in Islam, that are found in atheism. Yes, atheism is really like a religion. Puts the person in God's place. And also the idols of the mind found in the most popular religion of the last 1900 years, being the form of Christianity that we heard about, that accepts pagan holidays and traditions and its observances. And so it's going to be a difficult transition for many people, most people, which is why God will establish a headquarters in Jerusalem, and he will call for people to come up from the nations, to come up to keep the feast and to learn about the ways of true worship. Another prophecy of that time is Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14 and verse 16. One more page. It shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Eternal of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Eternal of hosts, on them there will be no rain. And it goes on to say, if the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague which the Eternal strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of all nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, it's one of the 5 annual holy days. Those holy days begin with a season of Passover that includes the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then it moves on to the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, or the Feast of First Fruits. We keep going forward, and then we come to a memorial of blowing of trumpets, also known as the Feast of Trumpets. We have the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles, including the 8th day. It's a favorite time of year for many of us. And it's likely going to be a favored time of year for many of people then. And it's pointed out. Out of all the holy days, he points out the Feast of Tabernacles. They're going to be called to come up. So it could be that it's not that that will be the only holy day of God that will be observed at that time, but this set of holy days is perhaps set aside as a time of training, a time of renewal. And that would be fitting for what the holy day represents. A time of restoration of all things, of God renewing the earth and renewing the faith of the earth. So God warns that those nations whose heads of family or state or national leaders, those who refuse to come up and keep the feast, that they will have no rain. No rain means that they will suffer a time of drought. And if this were not enough, there's mentioned also a plague. Now it would appear, just upon a natural reading of this translation, the King James or New King James is what I am reading, it appears that the plague is no rain. But it could be that the plague is something besides a lack of precipitation. Now, the complete Jewish Bible renders the translation this way, and this is verse 18. I'm going to read it from my notes from the complete Jewish Bible translation. It says, if the family of Egypt doesn't go up, if they refuse to come, they will have no overflow, talking about the Nile rising its waters and having a flow of water from the Nile. Moreover, it says, there will be the plague with which Adonai will strike the nations that don't go up to keep the festival of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And so a question then comes, what is the plague? Is it no rain? Or is there something additional that God will unleash, if you will, on those people that refuse to come up? To perhaps they need a little more persuasion to go up to the mountain of the Lord. Well, a possible answer is found earlier in this chapter in verse 12. I'm not going to read it, but verse 12 and going forward, it talks about a panic, a paranoia that God will cause to come upon people, and then flesh of many will rapidly decay. Whatever the plague will be, it is going to cause great discomfort, a lot of anxiety, and it is going to harm people that will resist going up and keeping God's feasts, meaning learning to walk in his ways, walk in his paths. And those will be people who will instead desire to continue to do their own thing, which means continuing in the way of the heathen. Isaiah 19, let's go back to the prophet Isaiah. The warning that God gave is to all nations of that time. Not just some, but all of them. Although it's interesting that the nation of Egypt is pointed out more than once. All of the holidays that men have created, celebrating deities of their own mind, those are going to be banned. And Christmas is one of those days. So it is interesting that God specifically mentioned Egypt more than once. And it may be that God foresees that the Arab people in Egypt are going to be particularly stubborn about this. It may be that Egypt will become an example to other nations because of their long history of idolatry. Even in the history books that we saw in the program, it says that those things can be dated back to Rome, which would mean also Greece, but even going further back to Egypt. And they do have a vast archaeological record of their pagan history, that's much of which still exists to this day, found in the structures that are still standing in Egypt, and all of the artifacts that have been uncovered and that are being circulated in museums around the world. I even saw some in Chicago when we visited there many years ago. Another prophecy in Isaiah chapter 19 foretells of the Egyptian resistance. Isaiah 19, and I'm going to read several verses here, beginning in verse 1. Behold, the Eternal rides on a swift cloud. And what did we read a sermon or two ago? We read Revelation 1 talking about God coming with clouds when he returns. The Eternal rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. I will set Egyptians against Egyptians. Everyone will fight against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, and this could be part of that plague. City against city, kingdom against kingdom. The spirit of Egypt will fail in its midst. I will destroy their counsel, and they will consult the idols and the charmers and the mediums and the sorcerers. And the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, which is typical of their people down through time, having cruel dictator-like people that govern them. The waters will fail, in verse 5, from the sea, and the river will be wasted and dried up. So here's, I think, reflected in where God said there will be no rain. The rivers will turn foul, the brooks of defense will be emptied and dried up, the reeds and rushes will wither, the papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown by the way of the river. They will wither, and be driven away, and be no more. The fishermen will mourn, and those will lament who cast hooks into the river, and they will languish who spread nets on the waters. Why? Because there's nothing to be gained. There's no food, no fish. Moreover, those who work in fine flax and those who weave fine fabric will be ashamed, meaning that they're not going to have work to do. They won't have any of the materials they need. And its foundations will be broken. All who make wages will be troubled of soul. And this is, I think, a bit of a mistranslation. I think the King James Version translates it a bit better when it says, all who make sluices and ponds for fish will be troubled. And I think this is referring to the lack of fish because of the lack of rain. So surely the foundations of Egypt, the foundations of making a living, the foundations of even survival, of maintaining life, they are going to be broken. Sadly, this is what it is going to take before those people will be turned around, before God will entirely heal them. But healing will come to the nation of Egypt. It will come. But sadly, only after much destruction. In verse 16, if you jump down a bit, in that day, Egypt will be like women and will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Eternal of hosts, which he waves over it. So what it means by being like women is they will be weak. Now, women can be strong people. Some people might say that's politically incorrect. It's comparatively speaking. Men are just naturally stronger than women, which is why we see those men that are claiming to be women and dominating women's sports today are winning everything, because men are stronger than women. It's just the part of how God designed us. And so that's what it means, that they will be like women. And they will be afraid. Not that all women are fearful, but these people will be afraid. And in verse 17, and the land of Judah will be a terror to Egypt. Everyone who makes mention of it will be afraid in himself because of the counsel of the Eternal of hosts, which he has determined against it. And it goes on to say in verse 18, in that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Eternal. So in other words, there will be cities that will declare loyalty to God. And then it goes on to say, one of these cities will be called the city of destruction. Now, I think this is talking about a period of time after God brings the drought, after he brings the plague, after one of those cities is destroyed, but it's still going to bear the title, the city of destruction. So it's interesting here that eventually there will be cities of significance that will become loyal to God. One of them, however, is going to be destroyed, and it's going to have this famous, or should I say infamous, title, the city of destruction. Well, what will be the reason for this? The reason of the city's ruin? Well, there is a bit of speculation involved in this, but when we consider the history of Egypt, and it's obvious, as God foretells, it's obvious continued resistance to God, to the law and order of God, it appears that there is going to be more than just a need for drought in order to turn those people around. In verse 19, it says, in that day there will be an altar to the Eternal in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Eternal at its border. I think this is much like the stones of the law that Israel erected on their borders, as found in Deuteronomy 27. That is, they will exist at some point. And it will be for a sign and for a witness to the Eternal of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they will cry to the Eternal because of the oppressors. So that wicked king or that tyrant that is put over them, the tyrants that oppress them, they are going to cry out to God, save us from these people. I think many of the Arab people are experiencing something similar to that right now in Iran. And he will send them a Savior and a mighty one, and he will deliver them. And then the Eternal will be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know that the Eternal in that day, and will make sacrifice and offering. Yes, they will make a vow to the Eternal, and they will perform it. And so God is going to heal that nation. People's hearts are going to be changed. They will turn. But before the widespread healing that God will bring can take place, they are going to have to experience the consequences of rebellion. Just like much of the earth will have to experience the consequences of violating God's laws. Centuries of idolatry are going to be a hard thing for people to give up, a hard thing to break. Now, currently, the Egyptian people recognize many holidays. They recognize the Islamic holiday of Ramadan, the Muslim sacrifice feast as well. They celebrate the birthday of Muhammad. The Egyptian people also have a twice yearly sun festival. There is a 5-day Sphinx festival. There is a holiday that is called the Fidelity of the Nile that they celebrate. There is a holiday called Laylat and Naktu, and I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but it means Night of the Teardrop, and it's an ancient holiday that they continue to celebrate, which is said to be founded in the idea that Isis, this goddess Isis, shed a tear for the death of one of her sons or one of her family, and that tear caused the Nile to raise the waters. And of course we know that happens naturally because the river just, its waters raise once a year. But they developed a pagan holiday in that regard that's still kept. And there's also been, and I just read this, there has been a recent revival. This started last year, 2021, a recent revival of the Opet Festival. And that is an ancient holiday that promotes the fertility of Amun-Re as well as the fertility of Pharaoh. And those are two of just the many, many Egyptian gods. Egyptians, they also celebrate, or at least many of them do, the Coptic Christmas as well as the Coptic Easter, which basically means they keep it at a different time of year, but it's pretty much the same holiday that most of the Western nations observe. So those are many festivals that have nothing to do with the God of the Bible and are contrary to the God of the Bible. And yet, people love them, and they're going to be difficult for people to give those up because people have fond memories of friends or family or activities, songs, the jingles that we hear once a year. There are traditional dishes that people eat and enjoy, or dances, even decking the halls, kissing under the mistletoe. People love that kind of thing. Baking hot cross buns. But such activities are rooted in a culture that actually rejects the true God, rejects the God of the Bible, rejects the Christ that is described in the Scriptures. And that is a culture that is going to have to change. It will have to change, or the people will be wiped out. So it's not going to be easy. Many are going to resist, and they will resist to the point of destruction. Now, the wages of sin are death. Ultimately, that is where it will lead if people continue. But before death, there will be cities that will lay in ruin. One of them will be called the city of destruction. And the devastation that God is going to bring, it will eventually change the minds of many people. So we look forward to that time, a time when the nature of mankind is sensitive to the ways of God, when people are humbled and the nations are turned around, a time when the narrow path will be walked instead of the broad way that leads to what? Destruction. Though the earth will vastly lay in ruin, all will not be lost. God is going to restore the planet. He will restore health. He will restore vitality to people and to the creation. And the holidays that have warmed the hearts of many are going to eventually become known for what they truly are. Futile. Hopeless. Nothing really tangible about them. It's going to take some time, but eventually all will be considered God's people. Now notice what it says as we continue in Isaiah 19, what it says about people who will eventually repent and will change. Isaiah 19, verse 23. Well, let's go ahead and read verse 21. Then the Eternal will be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Eternal in that day. And they will make sacrifice and offering. Yes, they will make a vow to the Eternal and perform it. And the Eternal will strike Egypt. He will strike it, and he will heal it. And they will return to the Eternal, and he will be entreated by them and heal them. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. They will become brothers in faith, like family. In that day Israel will be one of three with Egypt and Assyria. A blessing in the midst of the land. Can you imagine? It's almost hard to imagine that that will happen one day, that these people will become one in mind and purpose. Verse 25, whom the Eternal of hosts shall bless, saying, blessed is Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. And that is what you and I look forward to. It is something that we look forward to every Sabbath. The Sabbath portrays a time when the people of the earth will have a rest from all of the war and the suffering and the disease that we suffer as a result of rejecting God. A time when the people of the earth will unite under one God and one government. And the cities that will be destroyed because of their rebellion against the Most High, they will be rebuilt. And they will become communities of faith and hope. And we look forward to that renewal.